chapter 14 of Theologico-Political Treatise by Baruch Spinoza. This chapter is about faith. He tries to explain to us what faith is, and he also tries to, that's basically what he does throughout the chapter, like telling us what faith is and then trying to basically illustrate things around that topic. So he starts off by, there are a few things he says before he comes into the definition, and I thought maybe I shouldn't talk about that because it's about what he had talked about in the previous chapter. So in this chapter, he defines faith as faith consists in a knowledge of God, without which obedience to him will be impossible, and which the mere fact of obedience to him implies. So according to Baruch, faith has almost everything to do with obedience. And remember, I did mention in another video that he tells us that the primary goal of scripture, and we can say religion, is to get people to be obedient. The scripture is not written to pass any scientific knowledge or anything like that. The scripture is just there to make people obedient. Now, in this chapter now, he tells us obedient as what and to what. So to him, faith is about being obedient to God. But what does that exactly mean, being obedient to God? Of course, he says it starts with acknowledging the existence of God and then being obedient to that God. And now, when it comes to be obedient, how and about what, he basically, when you read everything, is kind of basically saying, when you acknowledge the existence of God and then you obey the divine law, then you can be described to have faith. He says, when you read the Bible, as I've mentioned, he does say that the primary goal of the scripture is to get people to be obedient. He says, he then uses some examples of where that obedience was sought. And for example, he says, Moses did not seek to convince the Jews by reason, but bound them by covenant, by oaths, and by conferring benefits. Further, he threatened the people with punishment if they should infringe the law, and promised rewards if they should obey it. And all these are not means of teaching knowledge, but for inspiring obedience. So he is basically giving us an example in the Bible that Moses did not go outright to teach the Israelites about a lot of things, even though he did do that in some aspects when you read the Pentateuch. But his primary goal was to make them obedient to God, and that meant living by the divine law of loving God and also loving their neighbor. I think not the next chapter, but the one that follows, he does talk about the state, and I've mentioned this, that it never occurred to me until I started reading this book, or I did read a review of this book. That's when kind of like occurred to me that the Old Testament is about a state. It's not a religion. It's a religion in a state. And in that chapter that I'm going to talk about later, he tries to explain to us the reasons why Moses had to set up a state. And in fact, he uses that kind of like to explain to us why we humans need the state. And the state here is like he calls a state or a commonwealth. And of course, when we say a state or a commonwealth, it's not necessarily like the nations or the states that you might think of. It could be a clan of people living together. Then they need to set up some rules and way of living together, because if they don't do that, then that state is going to fall apart. So he uses that to explain to us. There exists a God that is one of the most important aspects, like the two important aspects of faith, is number one, that there is God. So someone has to believe that there is God. And then they have to believe, they have to buy into the divine law, and that is loving that God and also loving their neighbor. And when it comes to loving their neighbor, it's about being charitable and being full of justice. Like, you don't do wrong to people, do bad things to people who don't deserve it. So you are being fair and you are just, and then you are charitable to them. You do good things to them. Now, that's a second component of that, like knowing there is God, and then being charitable and just to your neighbors. I think there's a third one that I'm missing, but these are the components of what faith is, according to Baruch, of course. and then he gives us like further tenets of, like, he breaks them down into like 5, I think, or 6. He tells us that one has to believe that there is God, or a supreme being. That supreme being has to be sovereign, just, and merciful, and exemplar of true life. Then he is the only one. He is omnipresent. That he has supreme right and dominion over all things. That the worship of God consists only justice and charity and love towards our neighbor. That all those who only obey God by their manner of life are saved, and the rest are punished. So there has to be, and in fact, he does talk a lot. He does mention this concept of reward and punishment. I think I might talk about it maybe in this video or another video. Reward and punishment is like a big thing in how you manage human beings, and it does so. That's one of the tenets he mentions here. Then you have another tenet of faith is the forgiveness, because he says no one is free from sin, so that without this belief all will despair of salvation. If the component of forgiveness is not included, then people are going to give up, because everybody sins. Like, you do things and then you realize, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that, or maybe that's against what God expects of me. And because now, if there is no forgiveness as part of the component of what drives faith, then people are going to give up. Then he does say this: the best faith is not necessarily possessed by him who displays the best reasons, but by whom displays the best fruits of justice and charity. So, like, when you approach religion and faith, you shouldn't expect to have someone to be judged by how they reason. That's not important. What is important is how they act towards their neighbor. Are they just, and are they charitable? And then do they recognize God? When they do that, then they have faith there. So to summarize it, this chapter, he is basically explaining to us that faith is the belief in God and the being obedient to the divine law, which is love God and love your neighbor. So he basically tells us that that's what's basically faith. Like, it has nothing to do with reason, with some scientific understanding or anything like that. It's just believe in God and acknowledge that God to be a supreme being with powers like to punish and reward, and having powers over everything else, and then to be charitable and just to others, which means like loving. So basically the divine law. So basically it's believing in God and then being obedient to the divine law. That's what he considers to be faith.